Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. This is part two in a series on speech. In the first part, I talked a little bit about, well, I talked a lot about speech and different kinds of speech and the kind of speech that I intended to focus on throughout this series, which is mainly political speech, free speech, protected speech, how American culture embodies speech, feels about speech. And in this part, I want to walk through some of the more interesting legislative and court rulings relating to speech in the history of the United States, because I think they're revealing. And I think that there's also a change in the air. And I think it's important to be mindful of where we've been so we can understand where we're going, because I'm not sure where we're going. I mean, I don't think we're going backwards, not significantly. I don't think we will, but I do think the struggle in the interim, that balance of power shift, the speech portion of that is becoming pretty gross right now. And I want to talk about that. But this bit is really the steps, right, that got us there. So if you slogged your way through that first part, let me just first congratulate you, because it was messy and it was not well structured. And I respect that you gave it a chance. And I really appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So strap in, baby, because here we go. It's going to be a fun ride of dry Supreme Court rulings. They're not dry. Again, when you look at sort of what was going on in each one of these cases, which I'm not entirely going to do, but I'll touch upon them a little bit. I really want to sort of focus more on the thematic, the connective tissue. But again, each one of these individual things is a window into some really dramatic stuff that was happening at that moment in time, and was informed by the things that came before, and informed the things that came after, relating to our processing of speech in the public consciousness. So I find it deeply fascinating and deeply illuminating, and I hope that you will join me. Hang out. The history of the United States has been a history for the struggle for speech, for freedom of speech, for freedom of expression, for freedom of religion, freedom in general, right? That's our thing. And it has been a struggle from the beginning against the tyranny that we were under before we became a nation. And then as soon as we became a nation, the struggle continued internally. What are we as a nation? What do we represent? How do we govern our people? And speech was then and is now a very central piece of that. I think we all, as Americans, can recognize that we feel real strongly about our individual freedoms, our ability to say and do what we want. This is America, damn it. Do what we want. That's not entirely true, but I think when you put it in a comparative framework against other nations that, perhaps are not as permissive in their desire to allow their citizenship to just spew whatever nonsense comes to their minds. There's been a history of suppressive tactics by authoritarian regimes throughout history. It's a truth. It's something we know, and it's something that is very important to us. And it's the reason why we cling to it. It's the reason why we cling so hard to our rights, because we are able to look around elsewhere in the world and see places that don't have that freedom to be, period. Just freedom to be, freedom to say what you want, what you're thinking, without fear of being arrested or fired from your job or, otherwise persecuted, I guess. That is a basic freedom that we have. And it is not an easy thing. It is not something that came naturally, and it is something we have had to continuously fight for. So let's get into it. This is not exhaustive by any means, obviously. I'm not a lawyer. as well. That's also, I think, fairly obvious. So I am obviously coming to this information as a citizen, as a person who is sort of digesting the history of our nation through these particular incidents. That is the disclaimer that I'd like to make to you. Again, that I do not pretend to any sort of authority on these positions, merely that, they happened and I have a brain and I'm interested in them. So I'm combining those features to express myself herein using my free speech. Yay! All right. John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. And John Adams was a complicated figure, often sort of thought to be kind of like a monarchist at heart. He wasn't. He just had, I think, a conservative viewpoint about how governance, should occur. And he didn't have any particular political grievances with monarchy and the parliamentary monarchy that England was in at that time. He just didn't want to pay unfair taxes, and he didn't want oppressive, tactics being forced upon others. And most importantly, he believed in the law, and he felt that the law should be the guide, and that should be the thing that, we look to for governance, and not the whimsical, emotional responses of a monarch. I think that's reasonable. And I think that all of the founding fathers and mothers really felt that that was really the essential argument, was just that they wanted their freedom and they wanted it to be fair. They wanted to live in law, but they also still believed all kinds of stupid bullshit. So let's not, put them up on the angel pedestal, just as a side note. They were flawed human beings just like us. For example, John Adams passed the Sedition Act, or rather, he was president at the time. So it was an executive order, a Sedition Act, and it criminalized anti government speech. That act was set to expire in 1801, and the then president, Thomas Jefferson, allowed it to expire because he wanted no truck with any of that. Now, after that, we had a big civil war, you may recall. And after the Civil War, they passed the 14th Amendment, which codified birthright citizenship and also allowed that all citizens would be afforded protections of the law, including due process of law. So that's an important piece of legislative and policy that really goes to speech, because your citizenship is really what allows you the protections of the First Amendment. So the 14th Amendment connects everybody, who live via this criteria, like born in the United States, etc., to have the rights afforded to them by all the other features of the Constitution. First and foremost, the First Amendment. Now, that's all well and good. You're aware, I think, that there were a lot of other policy and legislative maneuverings that happened on the state levels that pushed back against that idea, struggling to grapple with the idea that African Americans were human beings, let alone citizens. That took well over 100 years. I think there's some people out there who might still be working on it. So we move forward, and a second Sedition Act is passed in 1918, this time by Congress. And that Sedition Act, along with the Espionage Act, which had been passed the year prior in 1917, were intended to suppress anti-war speech. The First World War was happening, the Great War, and there were a lot of Americans who were not down. Moreover, socialism and communism were finding their way into the United States through communist memberships and other groups that really saw kind of promise in what Stalin was doing and in Lenin's ideas. And part of the reason that they thought that was because Stalin was extremely good about propagandizing and controlling information out of the Soviet Union into the world, that compelled this idea that the great communist experiment of the Soviet Union was working, that their farms were thriving, that their industry was, bursting at the seams, and they were producing, planes and tanks, and other people were, part of this glorious, revolution. And none of it was true. But because Stalin he was a strong man, and he had complete control over the media narrative, e.g. speech. He had complete control over journalists. He had complete control over state radio. He had complete control over any and all communications going out of Russia relating to the state. And he was able to persuade the whole rest of the world, who had a lot of other bigger fish to fry, including Hitler, that, everything was all cool. So a lot of people in the United States who looked to Marxism and socialist ideas as representative democracy, sort of embodied like a better version of the America that we already had, like Eugene Debs, who was the leader of the Socialist Party and who was arrested under the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act because he was speaking out against the war. And they used the realization later that Stalinism was, an oppressive and murderous regime to characterize Americans who subscribed to communist ideals as, tyrannical traitors, to the United States, which is a total, in most cases, misrepresentation of what these people were trying to achieve. I mean, let us not forget, it was Eugene Debs and socialists in the United States who birthed labor unions. It was those people that helped to crystallize the Democratic base at that time to want representation of the workers and not, capitalists and corporate moguls, basically, to be formulating policy in the United States. So that was happening during the United States sort of, golden age, this age of industry, this age of the railroads, the, radio and electricity. It was the beginning of capitalism as a political influence machine in the United States. And there were a lot of people who were like, hey, that's not really what democracy is. And the government's response to that was, shut the fuck up. We don't need to hear that. Shut up, shut up, shut up. So much so that they started arresting people. And they used these kinds of legislative acts under the rubric of suppressing anti-war speech because it was unpatriotic to do so, and they did a lot of harm in that. So in 1918, the Sedition Act was repealed, really for all the reasons above, right? It just was very obviously unconstitutional within the context of the First Amendment. And so the Supreme Court was like, nah, and they overturned it. Moving forward in time, and as the communist panic begins to amass itself in the United States, in 1931 in Stromberg v. California, there was a case involving nonverbal speech where there was a guy who was in the Communist Party, and he was flying a red flag, and he was arrested because at the time in California there was a red flag law. Now, what's interesting about that is we're talking about red flag laws right now, but our red flag laws are metaphorical, and this was quite literal. You couldn't fly a red flag. That was a crime to fly a red flag in California at that time. And Mr. Stromberg was arrested. He was a member of the Communist Party, which is why he was flying that red flag. And he was successful in, getting California to overturn that law. And he could fly all the red flags he wanted. Now, his neighbors, I'm sure, had shit to say about it, but that was for Mr. Stromberg to deal with and not the U.S. government. A lot of cases involving the press. A lot of cases involving injunctions or, local and state governments shutting down press communications under these sort of patriotic legislative arms like the Sedition Act and things like red flag laws. So in 1931, in Muir v. Minnesota, a press injunction was disallowed. And at that point, it became much more difficult for governments to influence what papers could print, stories that they could run, and the narratives under which they cast them. Also, editorials. Editorials continued to become legal fodder, but that doesn't really go away for quite a while. In 1937, in DeJong v. Oregon, the Public Assembly and Peaceful Assembly for Lawful Discussion is affirmed in this case. So in other words, political meetings. Once again, communists. Communists were meeting members of the American Communist Party were meeting to talk about, what communists talk about, like, let's make it fair, let's make it free, let's make it, everybody gets a piece, right? Like, I'm not saying that's the basically what communists talk about. I'm sure it's nuanced, right? And it runs a spectrum of people who, were down for Stalin, and others who were more for sort of, Marxist ideology and a, social democracy. So there's a spectrum. You should keep that in mind. Communists aren't just like, pinko radical assholes. There are ideas there, and the ideas are well woven into our existing frameworks. So, before you're just like, rah, commies, please know that it's not communism as, embodied by the Soviets is not how communism manifested itself elsewhere in the world. China is a really good example of that. That form of communism really way more successful, first of all, no less onerous in my view, but very, very effective as a strategy for control and domination and media manipulation and crafting of state narrative and so forth. And yet it is not the murderous regime at the scale that Stalin was. I would argue that it's still a murderous regime, but not nearly at the scale that Stalin was at. So, I just think that's a relevant distinction to make. And again, a lot of these cases involve people who held political beliefs that were contrary to an understanding of political consciousness, and then the state, local levels trying to manifest that will into a legislative landscape, and then getting to the Supreme Court and then being like, nope, that doesn't really jive with our basic rights as a nation. So, that is why these things are important. Like, states' rights are great. It is all well and good that the people of each state community should be empowered to manage their own governance, because they are distinct and they cannot be cookie cutter, governed, right? Like, every geographic area, it has this different social, economic history, right? There are reasons why it is incredibly important states maintain a sovereignty of a kind. But it is equally important to understand that there are principled and practical effects that roll out to all American people, and that the borders between states complicate the expression of those things and allow for those freedoms to be equally distributed throughout. That's really what it kind of boils down to in when it comes to cases like speech cases. And others, guns are another excellent example of that. Abortion is another excellent example of that, where, the basic conflict between the state will and, the federal will, kind of demonstrates the degree to which all Americans are affected by a given issue, and the federal government, kind of asserting that those rights are enshrined in our Constitution, sort of, overriding that public consciousness. Because the states, I think, are where the rubber hits the road relative to people really asserting their own individual political will. And that's as it should be. I don't quibble with that. But it muddies the waters, considerably. We're huge as a country. Like, geographically, we're huge. We have 329 million people or something like that. Like, it's insane. Moving on. Actually, not moving on. This DeJong v. Oregon decision also kind of happened in the time that Senator McCarthy was having hearings about, I can't remember what it was. It was like the Committee for Un-American Activity or something like that. And he did some really horrible stuff to persecute and punish people who had dissenting political voices. In 1940, Thornhill versus Alabama, a decision upholding the right to political protest, a very, very important ruling, particularly as we move into the civil rights era, the peak of the civil rights era in the United States. 1940 as well. You have the Smith Act, which makes it a crime to advocate for violent overthrow of the government. I think that that's an interesting ruling, because this is one of those examples of, kind of dancing on the line, right? Like, we're tap dancing on that that line between assertion of political will and, rights in the Constitution in some ways. And I think this is a really good example of attempting to legislatively mitigate speech in the interest of a public good. Hate speech is an example that we deal with today, and I think is an analog to this, right? It's very hard to pin it down if you're an average citizen. If there's no legal framework really to define what is hate speech, or to define what is an legitimate advocacy for violent overthrow of the government, right? Like that's a pretty high legal bar to meet, and that's as it should be. I think it's important that that level of scrutiny have to be applied to things like this, because speech is a thing that we all do in a cavalier way a lot of the time. And so it's sort of like your spouse got murdered and you were overheard to say, I'm going to kill you. Does that mean that you actually did it? It's an expression of your anger, like in that moment. It doesn't, it may be an indicator of motive, but it doesn't constitute proof that you did the act either. So you can see the complication there in that area, which is why it's pretty hard. And this informs our social media universe right now as well, for I think probably kind of intuitive reasons, but I'll get into it a little bit. In 1957, in Roth v. U.S., you see a ruling in which obscenity is not protected speech. And this is a decision that codifies a sort of puritanical moment in the United States in which we decided that I view this one kind of in the same lane as like a Plessy v. Ferguson kind of ruling. Like this was a Supreme Court ruling that really expressed white voter sensibilities in that moment in time, puritanical kinds of principles that lock down speech in favor of modesty and humility and a implicit nod to a white power structure. So I think that ruling was super fucked up. And I think it really caused a lot of harm. And it is the reason why Lenny Bruce suffered in the way that he did, as a person who was really just a cool dude trying to entertain people. People thought he was funny, and he, used language that the government codified as obscene, and they arrested him again and again and again and again. And this motherfucker was just out there trying to make jokes. Like, what the fuck? So in 1958 and 59, there were some rulings involving privacy cases involving membership disclosures. So basically, if you are going to go into a country club, you want to be a member of a country club, like you have to tell us if you have a membership to any, this list of groups. And is the communists, they really wanted to nail, they wanted to identify people who were communists. So you can't come to our country club if you were a member of the Communist Party or are a member of the Communist Party. It just, I mean, you get it, right? Like, I don't really need, I understand you may have strong feelings about communism. You come by them honestly. We've all been fed a whole bunch of bullshit about communism over the years, so I don't judge that. I also think it's relevant and useful to put it within a more practical and more impartial context. And the impartial context is that we fucking freaked out about communism, and then anybody who wanted to say fuck on the air was painted with this big red brush and shunned publicly, and their livelihoods were affected, and in some cases they were met with violence. And it's damaging. The mob is not a thing to play with, and that's what these kinds of political maneuverings do. In 1961 and 1962, Lenny Bruce was repeatedly convicted on obscenity, but his stuff was overturned. Like all of his arrests and convictions were overturned in 1964 because it became clearer and clearer that that was just some straight bullshit. And there was a lot of political pressure at that time through counterculture movements that were intersecting with student intellectual groups and things like that to assert a political will of its own in a more established framework. fighting in court and things like that. There were a ton of cases where the government is trying to suppress anti-war speech, both in World War I, World War II, and in Vietnam. The first and the last being the more active. I mean, World War II, everybody was kind of yay on that. And, not initially, but once Japan attacked, I mean, everybody was like, fuck those guys. Like, we were all about the war in World War II. But not before. Before that, people were like, ugh, we really don't want to do this again. Europe was in the same boat. I mean, we weren't alone, but, we were specific kinds of assholes before we decided to get into World War II. We're more than happy to look aside from the reporting about the famine in Stalin's Soviet Union. We were more than happy to look away from the atrocities that were occurring in Germany and in Poland and in the Eastern Bloc countries, or rather at the time, the Baltic states. The United States' hands are not clean in those, in our isolationism in those moments. I mean, certainly the proof of our influence in the wars themselves, I think, is excellent evidence for why our complacency and our willingness to ignore these things for a long, long time, it's damning. That evidence is damning kind of in and of itself. In 1969, in Brandenburg v. Ohio, this was a unanimous SCOTUS decision in which speech advocating use of force or crime is not protected if the advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and the advocacy is also likely to incite or produce such action. So this is kind of what I'm talking about relative to the Smith Act, right? Making it a crime to advocate for violent overthrow of the government. It's very general. It allows the government to sort of use broad enforcement capabilities. But Brandenburg is a totally different animal. Brandenburg is creating a pretty narrow criteria lane for the identification of insurrectionist speech and things like that. So I think that that's important, and I think it's a really effective legal mechanism to identify when free speech becomes an act of something else, like a manifestly different sort of act. In 1971, Baird v. the Bar of Arizona, that decision was prohibiting or limiting inquiries of personal beliefs or association and prevents exclusion from an employment on those grounds. Again, communism. Tell us if you're a commie. You can't do that anymore. As of 1971, and Baird said an excellent decision there that really supported the rights to privacy and begin to pave the way for privacy issues that we are still dealing with today. In 1982, Board of Education versus PICO, prohibiting schools from removing books on the grounds of disagreeing with ideas. That was 1982 that we're not going to ban books anymore. So kind of recent, you guys. I think it speaks pretty significantly to how political will shapes our culture, in that it's shaping the education of our children in that particular framework. So up until 1982, we were very free to define the histories and define the narrative of American culture through a very selective lens. 1988, my favorite one, Hustler v. Falwell. You've probably seen it in the People versus Larry Flynt, relating to political speech, satire, flag burning, that sort of thing. And that sort of as well spoke to a lot of those obscenity cases, because it was, I think, through that process that we get the famous quote of pornography, like, when you see it, kind of thing. I may be wrong about that, but it sounds legit. Look me up. I don't know. Fact check me. In 1992, RAV v. the City of St. Paul, a case invalidating a hate speech ordinance. And I cite this last one because I think that we begin to see a resurgence back into the assertion of political will through the sanctioning by the state, and that I think we're beginning to see that pendulum swing back in that direction in some pretty big ways. is my opinion about that. And I think that the Supreme Court right now is in a position to do some pretty specific harm in that way, enforcing a political will and not upholding or interpreting legislative questions under the impartial lens of the Constitution. That's kind of not what we've got going on in our Supreme Court right now. I think much of the jurisprudence relating to speech represents, the courts invalidating political consciousness when it conflicts with the principles of our founding documents. There's a constant flow of suppression of political dissent from the ideals represented by a power base, and we've been pretty successful at holding the line legislatively and through court decisions throughout the history of our country. But sometimes more than others, right? There have been successes and there have been failures. There have been steps forward and steps backwards. Even in I think we're about to take a big step backwards with the likely overturning of Roe v. Wade. So I say this as a way of almost comforting myself that this isn't the doom necessarily that we feel it might be. It is a step backwards, and that's a bummer, for progressives, of course, but it also is a normal process of political exercise. And it also doesn't represent a state of permanence. And I think that there's a lot of power behind the voices that look for equity, that look for inclusion, that look for, an open space where all voices can be heard. And I think that our government, which is ultimately a constituent body made up of people, I think that the foundational structures are pretty strong. And I think that there's a lot of people who really are focused on, the dangers. I hope you're one of them as a listener. I hope you understand the dangers that we have, that we're facing, just how fundamental they are, because they're really fundamental. It doesn't require you to go out and become, a social justice warrior or a political activist or community organizer, none of it. But, having a consciousness about how your speech affects your political will and vice versa, and how you're expressing that to the people around you. How are you expressing it in social media, or are you? I don't. Mostly, for example, I really don't talk much of politics on social media because I think it's toxic. I don't want to go there because people are mean online. So I hope you enjoyed this bit, which I find really illuminating. I definitely would encourage you to go and just do a little bit of reading about some of the cases that were really important moments in the history of our country relative to creating that more perfect union. Each one of these cases that I talked about, and many, many, many more, were baby steps, in that direction. And some of them, again, baby steps backwards, but baby steps nevertheless, and important signifiers of what, as a people, we prioritize as our needs as citizens. So I find it illuminating, and I find it encouraging. It's reassuring, to me, to see that for as long as this country has existed, and long before, there are people who are willing to put their voices out there to shape policy that benefits everybody. And I love that. I think it's beautiful. So that's what I got for you this time. And I hope that you enjoyed it, that you'll come back for the next one. So thanks for joining me. I hope you appreciated it and got a little something out of it, made your juices flow a little bit. If you have thoughts or feedback or ideas or stuff that you'd like me to dive in a little bit more, I hope you'll reach out. You can connect with me by email. I have an email address at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI makes a podcast at gmail.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at Susie Makes a Podcast. So thanks very, very much. I hope you'll come back for my next bit. Should be fun. Until next time.